And so there we go. You have been warned. So we're very happy to have Peter and Hamid here today. Hamid Mirhosseini is an associate professor at the Language and Literacy Education Unit of the Faculty of Education at the University of Hong Kong. His research areas include the sociopolitics of language education, qualitative research methodology, and critical social linguistics and discourse studies. He's a published author of many different studies and volumes, and especially relevant for today, the 2025 Critical English Medium Instruction in Higher Education co-edited volume published by the Cambridge University Press. Hamid is currently an associate editor of the Journal of Language Identity and Education as well. And then co-editor of that same volume that I've just mentioned is also Peter De Costa, who is a professor at the Department of Linguistics, Languages and Cultures and the Department of Teacher Education at Michigan State University. He's also an honorary professor at St. Andrews, and he's also the English as a second language graduate director in the College of Education. He considers himself a critical applied linguist, and therefore his research areas include emotions, identity, ideology, and ethics in language learning, language teaching, and language policy. He's the co-editor of TESOL Quarterly, the associate editor of the Modern Language Journal, and a past president of the American Association for Applied Linguistics. I have to say we are especially pleased to have been able to have both of you in the room today. You know, different time zones, different geographical collocations have not stopped you, so we really appreciate that. And without further ado, I'm going to leave the floor to you.
Thank you for the introduction. And then Hamid is going to start things off. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Peter. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you for inviting us to give this talk today. And good evening and good afternoon and good morning to everyone in different time zones. And so I hope we're going to have a fruitful around 1 hour of discussion on issues of critical EMI, as we'll be talking about the continued quest for critical EMI and some suggestions for the road ahead and new directions. So perhaps we can start with an outline. So we'll be talking about this, the overall idea of critical EMI. And then a quick note about the book that Beatrice just mentioned. And then, so I'll be presenting this, and we'll have Peter's commentary. And then we'll have 2 more recent studies just published on different aspects of critical EMI into Asian contexts, and notes about 2 new areas of inquiry in this regard. So that's a quick outline, but let me start with a brief note on this notion of criticality, the concept of critical. So I think it can be a contested term. It's not very easy to agree on what it means. I understand it can raise sensitivities or discussions or debates at some points, because it's quite open to interpretations and can have various, there could be various understandings of that. And but the idea that is relatively easy to agree on, and that's what we had in mind when we talked about critical EMI, is moving beyond technicality. So when we talk about EMI, that I element, instruction, is mostly about linguistic challenges, pedagogical issues and questions and problems. So it's natural that many studies focus on the technicalities of language, communication, and education. But a broad notion of criticality that can be adopted is moving a bit beyond those technicalities and thinking about issues of culture, society, and politics. So, of course, when you think about criticality, there could be different ways of conceptualizing it. So that's why we've we've written about clashing criticalities. It's possible that different people who might see themselves as critical might disagree. And that's, I think, quite needed because we don't want criticality to become one regime of thought of its own. But based on this broad, inclusive view of criticality, there are a few elements or features that can be considered as central to this notion of critical. So by critical, we mean understanding and policy, practice, and research, which is aware of and sensitive to ideologies, policies, identities, and the notion of diversity, and the politics of English, which includes its history and economy. So I suppose this is a broad enough conception which can include many perspectives from many different kind of people with different backgrounds from around the world, across cultural and social types of background and thinking and philosophies. So if you are aware of and sensitive to these issues, some of them at least, then we can say you are within the realm of criticality, regardless of the specific position or the standpoint. So if we take that conception of criticality, then obviously the notion of critical EMI as a clear intertextual reference to critical applied linguistics, which I suppose is quite well known, and with its own root in already existing ideas of critical linguistics and critical pedagogy, which have been around for more than half a century now, and the notion of critical language pedagogy, critical language education is quite well known, at least theoretically, in the field. And in addition to that, we have these already existing terms: critical literacy, critical language testing, critical EAP, critical language teacher education, and various subdomains of critical applied linguistics. So this is the theoretical backdrop. But one point to consider is that areas like testing, as I referred to, or EAP, they are already established areas. They have their own roots. They have had their own developmental trajectories. And most of them are rooted in modernist traditions, positivist background, or structural linguistics. So those are the kind of backgrounds that have fed these areas. So when those ideas of like critical testing or critical EAP were proposed, they arrived a bit late, so to speak. So what was needed was an overall like overhaul of the entire area. So that was a bit maybe difficult. So that's why we never witnessed a trend of critical testing or critical applied linguistics as such. However, when we think about EMI, the one feature is that EMI can be seen as something still growing, not fully developed like those areas that I named. So there are already existing arguments that EMI is just starting to grow. So we see like around 2 decades ago in Europe, EMI was not really a huge phenomenon, but now it's quite expanding. In other places in Asia, they're just starting to emerge. And in some other places like Latin America, like Africa, they've just emerged, and in some other places, you can say they haven't yet emerged. So compared with an area like testing, one thing to consider at this point is that when we talk about critical EMI, bringing those critical kind of attitudes into EMI policy, practice, and research, is in a sense timely. So that's the time, because while it is still emerging, it's easier, perhaps relatively easier to to introduce critical thoughts. So what we mean by critical EMI, very broadly speaking, is that we need to consider those issues of ideology, policy, identity, diversity, and the politics of English. Of course, they already exist, as I said, in different parts of the field, and there have been critical studies of EMI, but the introduction of this notion as a specific term or flag is an invitation for first more explicit focus, because if we understand those issues at the background, many people understand that, but we invite it to more explicit focus, then this needs to be a bit more coherent rather than random, and inclusive, broader, more people in terms of quality and quantity to explore more, to think more about EMI in terms of those critical features. So that's the general idea of critical EMI, which is, as I said, it already existed by the time when we shared that idea. And now, of course, we have more of that kind of research. And so these are the ideas we discussed first in this paper in Pedagogy, Culture, and Society. And we shared some of these ideas in more details. And so later then, or around the same time, we started working on this book that Bert has just mentioned. And so the idea was actually to invite a group of people who worked on critical EMI to take this first step in a more coherent, as I said, explicit, coherent, and focused manner to bring their studies together. And so that's why we had this volume published by Cambridge University Press. And so the chapters in three different parts, they actually present some instances. So it's not basically, as we see, critical EMI is not something to fully cover in a book or in many books. But actually, this is just an invitation and a set of examples to, and then there are many, many questions out there, research questions in diverse contexts with different groups to be explored. So this is just a first step, and then in the hope that this can be continued by other people in other contexts. So this was done by a group of contributors from literally around the world, all continents, in various contexts, mostly co-authored chapters. And so these are the contributors. And so if we take the origin and the affiliation of the contributors, these are the countries that have been covered in different continents. And if we add their research context, so the origin, the affiliation, and the research context all together, this would be the map of the contributions in this volume. And so just a final note before I pass on to Peter, here are two reviews from David Block, who focused on this, who highlighted the crowded market of EMI books. And so he thought this is an interesting collection. And for Angel Lin, she referred to the complex ideological and economic forces at play in EMI that she thought is being explored in this volume. So I stopped there, and so Peter, can you also join us, please? And then we'll continue with the studies at the later stage.
Thanks, Hamid. And so Hamid and I are going to tag team. He's going to help advance the slides. Beatrice, thank you for dropping the registration link. I've just signed up as a member, so I appreciate the opportunity. As mentioned, we are the third lecture in this series of lectures. I just want to say a few words in the next slides about how things are evolving respect to what was mentioned in the book. And the book was done a year ago, so thoughts have gone in advance, and also to talk about the different things that the previous two speakers mentioned. Next, please, Hamid. So Hamid talked about the socio-cultural concerns and the socio-political issues concerning EMI, and I do want to also kind of make that link in terms of how it overlaps with a book that we did earlier a few years ago in 2020, The Sociopolitics of English Language Testing. Next, please. But then, of course, that hints at the dark side of EMI, right? And of course, EMI has its positives, but it also has many other facets that warrant further investigation. Uh, Assessment being one of those dimensions that need to be problematized. Next, Hamid. So, if you were at the second lecture a few weeks ago, Samantha Curl talked about the need to rethink achievement in EMI because assessment in particular can be particularly problematic. Next, please. And then one thing she pointed out was how EMI research has often equated achievement to three things: English language proficiency, an emphasis on grades and GPA, something which I'll come back to later in this presentation, and how we often misinterpret linguistic ability as evidence of actual learning. All right, so these are, I think, enduring concerns that also probably speak to your own interests with respect to EMI research. But what she did point out, Samantha, was of course the lack of epistemic access. And so by extension, we need to think about more carefully about epistemic injustice that might be occurring, not just to students, but also to teachers as well, who are, of course, involved in this EMI enterprise. Specifically, I think we need to think about how language, in particular English, mediates access to epistemic participation. Next, Hamid. And so then we had Jim's talk about the need to focus on preparedness, right, in EMI. Also echoing Samantha, this shift in lens and in focusing on proficiency to take into account, next, please, the development of academic literacy, because too much emphasis has been placed on English language proficiency, right? And we need to think about how ways can we kind of make it epistemal, to make it more just on an epistemic level in terms of allowing learners and teachers in EMI contexts to participate in knowledge production. Next. I do like the question, or what she called a provocation, Samantha, in her final slide. The question that she asked was, what would achievement look like if EMI assessment were designed for multilingual knowledge making rather than monolingual norms? And I'd like to hook and focus on this idea of multilingualism. Next, please, Hamid. Because we need to realize that many of us working in EMI contexts and also working with learners in EMI contexts, that ultimately we're in community with multilingual learners, right? And therefore, I think it's vitally important that we make both learners and teachers in those contexts aware critically of their multilingual repertoires in that sense. I've talked about it in my work with my colleague Kun Van Gob about the need to center CMLA, or critical multilingual language awareness, within teacher education. I work, as mentioned earlier, in two departments, the Department of Linguistics, Languages and Cultures, and the Department of Teacher Education. And so as a teacher educator, I'm also very much involved in the education of pre-service teachers. I'm happy to talk more about CMLA, but I would like to also underscore the need to develop critical EMI awareness, and that's going to be the topic that Hamid's going to say a little bit more about next. Hamid, back to you.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Peter. Yeah, so as I said, that the idea was just an invitation, and even the volume, as I said, you can't say it covers yeah, critical EMI, because it's not something to cover. It's going to be continued quest. So then what Peter mentioned are actually lines of critical EMI that can be seen in existing discussions, current discussions or research on EMI. But here I'm going to briefly share two recent studies as two more instances only. So again, as I said, this is not going to cover a wide area, but just two instances that give us examples of how, while in almost all EMI contexts, issues of linguistic challenges and instructional problems, in addition to policy concerns, economic struggles and everything, in addition to all of those immediate concerns, there could be this focus on the critical aspects along with those other aspects of inquiry. So this first study was in the context of Hong Kong, in a school context. And basically, the starting point was considering those ideas of ideology and those elements of critical view. The starting point was a view of the politics of English and the spread of English and the history of English in post-colonial context and the neocolonial expansion in other contexts discussed by critical applied linguistics scholars. So then specifically, this was connected to the dark side of EMI, as Peter mentioned. So considering this, I focused on, and of course, these are the aspects of that critical EMI awareness that were considered. So awareness of and sensitivity to issues of critical EMI. So taking that, we focus on the context of Hong Kong, which is one of the global centers of EMI, university EMI, but also school-level EMI, and the focus were school teachers. So the context was actually a high school, one high school in Hong Kong, a local one, a local government school, but an EMI one. So the question was EMI teachers, actually teachers of contents, like content subjects, physics, chemistry, all kinds of school subjects, about the role of English in shaping students' sociocultural attitudes and ideas. So basically, it was about their critical EMI awareness, while they were not language teachers, they were content teachers, so EMI teachers. So interviews were done with 21 teachers, and to support this, the understanding of their awareness, I also analyzed a set of documents, policy documents from the Hong Kong Education Bureau to see the policy landscape, official policy landscape, before I went to the teachers. So here I just give you a quick sketch of the findings. From the documents, there are four themes that emerged from the documents, showed some policy trends that could be considered somehow contradictory in terms of English teaching and teaching through English. There was emphasis on both Chinese and English. So Hong Kong is known for its trilingual biliterate policy. But at the same time, there was a lot of emphasis on English for greater opportunities, and also emphasis on English when there was talk of English as a medium of instruction. The focus was on achievement. So it was not really seen as a social phenomenon or something beyond the linguistic means. So the point in many of those documents was, when you adopt English as the medium, then does it help student achievement or not? And finally, in some documents, there was, considering all of those ideas, there was emphasis on more English. So this was a quick idea of the landscape of the documents. But when we talk to one more point about the documents. In some recent documents, like this one in 2017, there was a quick mention of critical attitude. But it was interesting to see that in the same document, this is the third quote below is about NETs, so-called native English teachers. So the document says native English teachers are advised to cultivate students' interest in the English language and traditions associated with English-speaking countries. So it could be interpreted in different ways. You can call it indeterminacy or contradiction or whatever, but that's the landscape, a quick view of the landscape of the documents. But when I talk to teachers, there are three major themes I quickly share here. One was that, as expected, the instrumental necessity of English is the most important thing they highlighted. So this is something normalized, which is heard everywhere. We see in many studies in different parts of the world. So they talked about this and they emphasized, they highlighted, and sometimes they exaggerated this instrumental necessity of English as their concerns when they teach subject courses through English. So English is very important and getting more and more important. It's the most common language for us. And there is only English. We must use English when it comes to education. So this is their perspective of the instrumental functionality of English. They also expressed a vague and general idea in multiculturalism. We are respecting students' culture and non-Chinese students from diverse cultures, and they can present their own culture through English. Things like that, statements like that were made by teachers. But among the same statements, at the same time, you see that they quickly change to this very familiar idea of English as just a means of communication. So it's not easy to interpret that kind of interest in multiculturalism, maybe just paying lip service to that, or just a general kind of sense of respect rather than understanding English and EMI from this specific perspective. Then in terms of the influence on people's, on students' identities through EMI, when English is given to students, when they are exposed to English through EMI, in terms of the influence on their identities, some people understand that, yeah, there is an influence. It can influence who they are. But the dominant idea was that this is not relevant. So they're learning subject things, biology or physics or chemistry or math through English. So it's not related. So that I think, no, that was the statement from one teachers. And even beyond that, at least one teacher said, I can't say it's a bad thing. So there is this influence. As I said, most of them see some kind of identity-related issue in EMI. But the point is that they see it as something normal that comes with English. So, so when it comes to this identity shaping aspect of English, again, some of them or most of them see no relationship. Some of them that see the relationship, they don't see it as problematic. So they separate these two. They don't look at it from an identity perspective. And there was only one teacher who had this kind of critical attitude. And so these are the questions from that teacher who decided that English is the common language of the world. This is actually because of the atrocities of the past on different countries. English has a dark past. So this is not really, I don't think she had access to that, to the theoretical ideas of the dark side of EMI. This is a statement from herself. So this is the landscape. But overall, that when we put all of these understandings together, we see that there is a challenge in this context, and that we can't say that people are generally they possess this overall critical EMI awareness. It's not easy to measure it, but the general understanding is that, at least in this context, which has a long history of EMI, and EMI is quite serious at school level and almost dominant at the higher education level, it's mostly viewed at the technical level. So there might be the need for further expansion of this critical EMI perspective at the policy level and the practice level for teachers, and obviously maybe for learners and parents. So that's one instance. The second study that I quickly share here is is in the context of mainland China and in the context of higher education, university education in the mainland. So again, starting with the same perspective of critical EMI, but this time focusing on policies. The background of policy studies in EMI exists. So there are policy studies, but the predominant conception of policy is administration and management rather than ideologically constructed and constructing forces. So there are already existing policy studies, but this specific study looked at policy again from the neocolonial, the perspective of the neocolonial dominance of English. So in the context of China this time, as I said, for higher education, and we had two questions. One was about higher education policies, the national level policies in mainland China. And the second question was about EMI policies at a certain group of universities. So the different types of universities, but this specific study focused on a set of programs, actually, which are called cooperative transnational programs, jointly run by a Chinese university and a foreign university, so-called foreign university, almost always coming from an English-speaking country. So the questions were about the policy lines related to EMI in these at these two levels, the national ones and the ones for these cooperative programs. So again, we had documents, two sets of documents from these two levels, national documents and university documents from 52 selected programs, which represented more than 1,100 programs, such programs around the country. So 4 lines of ideas emerged from the documents, and we'll see the same 4 repeated for the university level, actually, but the directions are quite different. So for the national level, the emphasis was, one, on textbooks with Chinese characteristics, so integrating ideological ideas into textbooks. Then something that was called comprehensive English language proficiency, emphasizing global governance and leadership. And Chinese was clearly emphasized as the basic teaching language nationwide. And there was emphasis on something called the Chinese university culture, shaped based on distinctive styles and spirits of China. So the 4 lines of inquiry are quite nationally oriented or nationalistically oriented, while English is emphasized for its functionality. But when we go to those university level documents, the same 4 features are present, but almost the opposite direction. So while the national documents focused on Chinese textbooks, the university documents emphasized so-called original materials, and they named English-speaking countries or partner universities from English-speaking countries. So they put a lot of emphasis on this originality, so-called originality of the documents, in contrast with the national policy. Then for English proficiency, while the national policies emphasized global governance and comprehensive English, the emphasis of the university was mostly test results, and they refer to IELTS test scores. And as the language, the universities clearly put Chinese as only a supplementary language. So teachers and the university, the program in general, were supposed to use English for instruction and even beyond instruction. And finally, instead of focusing on the Chinese university culture, there was emphasis on so-called advanced educational concepts, so imported educational structures. So as we see in this quote, adopting British-style education or so-called high-quality international courses, things like that. So the 4 items of textbooks, English proficiency, the language of instruction, and the university culture, and all these 4 elements, it's seen the government has a general policy direction functioning, in a sense, against the dominance of English while they wanted it to be used. But the universities seem to be embracing them very openly. English and what comes with English through EMI. So again, we see the dichotomy, the 2 sides, and one is more open to, in a sense, open, but in a sense submissive to the colonial, neocolonial spread, and the other side is quite the opposite. And so there's a challenge between these 2 policy governance levels, and such contradictions can emerge only through a critical perspective, and then what should be done and what needs to be done at different levels should follow follow reflections on this kind of policy environment. And so based on these, then there could be reflections on decolonizing the discourse of EMI in general, and decolonizing EMI at the level of policy, practice, and research. So again, as I said, these are just 2 quick studies, 2 recent studies, and questions like these are many out there, thousands of questions focusing on different aspects in different settings, emerging EMI settings or established EMI settings. Questions are there to be explored. And one final point is that, of course, we're not asking everyone to become ideology researchers or polity researchers, identity researchers. One way to consider all of these kinds of developments and the new directions that Peter will be talking about is to include a critical gaze into their own research. So if people are researching the instructional aspects, policy issues, pedagogical aspects, linguistic challenges in different contexts, they can also include a bit of a critical gaze within their own study rather than shifting their entire focus on these critical trends. And so Peter will now share a few more points about some possible new directions.
Thanks, Hamid. So thanks for emphasizing the tensions between policy and practice, and also how things might be interpreted differently, right? Depending on where you're situated. I'll briefly talk about 2 possible areas of inquiry in EMI next, please. And so Hamid has talked quite extensively about EMI in relation to identity and ideology. But at the same time, I think that, and those are certainly important areas of inquiry, and we also need to realize that neoliberalism is the elephant in the room, right? Because many EMI programs are also kind of driven and shaped by neoliberal impulses in that sense, partly because of the need to raise the rankings of universities internationally. But I'd like to draw your attention to one possible area, which is EMI and emotions. Next, please. And while we need to think about the impact of identity and ideology on, say, learners and teachers and even teacher educators, and I do want to emphasize this, a lot of work has been done in relation to learners and teachers, right? And at the start of the presentation, Hamid mentioned that critical EMI encompasses assessment, language education, and literacy. I think it's very important for us to think about the emotional consequences of being in EMI contexts, right? For example, if you're a learner having to negotiate a curriculum entirely in English, or if you're a teacher, for example, you're a math teacher having to teach your content subject in a language that might not necessarily be your first, right? And so I'd like to draw your attention to some earlier work that was done with my colleagues here, Sarah Hillman, Wendy Lee, and Curtis Green Enix, where we looked at EMI and emotion in higher education contexts. Next, please. And so this was something that we looked at a while ago. Next. Uh, so one of the things that we talked about was how we need to broaden our lens, right? I mentioned earlier, learners, teachers, teacher educators, but other stakeholders are also involved in this entanglement, right? Administrators, because Hamid, for example, just talked about university policies. Alumni, right, who have a vested interest. They've spent a lot of time and effort going through these EMI programs. And of course, families, because many of these students make those decisions guided by their parental ambitions in that sense, right? So parents who think that and being enrolled in an EMI program would probably enhance their social mobility and prospects for future employment. There's been a lot of focus on language in terms of EMI research, but I think increasingly, and specifically written language more than anything else, right? A point that Samantha Curley mentioned a few weeks ago. But perhaps now we need to look at other multimodal resources, given the fact that, for example, digital multimodal composing is, among other things, is a big thing in terms of curriculum uh, change. And therefore, by extension, to think about how emotions attach to policies, discourse, and certainly practices. And specifically, I urge to think about the emotional labor that might have to be borne by teachers who work in EMI contexts. Next, please. Um, uh, Hamid has presented two studies, one based in Hong Kong involving teachers there, another based in China. I'm going to give you another example that's based in China, but I only have about two slides. But I'm glad to see that people, you who are here today, you work in contexts outside of Hong Kong and China. I'd love to hear more about the work that you're doing. I see colleagues from the UAE, for example, colleagues from Sweden here, and I look forward to the dialogue with you. Next, please. So one of the things theoretically that I've been dealing with, and this is drawing on work with my former student Wendy Lee, who's now based in an American international branch campus in China, right? And we've been drawing on the work of acceleration theory from the sociologist Hartmut Rosa. And to put it very quickly and briefly, acceleration theory underscores the need for us to do everything more quickly than before, right? We need to achieve more in less time. And that, of course, those pressures, those neoliberally oriented pressures ultimately trickle down to administrators, teachers, and students. And I want to go back to what I mentioned earlier, drawing on Samantha Curley's point about how EMI has really placed a lot of emphasis in terms of achievement in with respect to doing well in courses and getting a high GPA. Next, please. So I'm going to present two data excerpts from this study that I've done with Wendy Lee. And this is a student enrolled in, as I mentioned, an EMI program in China, an American transnational university. And she says, I think I'm someone who's really sensitive to grades, tired, just so tired. I've always felt like I'm studying for the grades, but after I hit a setback recently, a drop in GPA because of getting B grades in two major courses, I felt I wasn't doing so well academically. It felt like a slap in the face. That made me start thinking, and this is like a mind-blowing revelation here. Should I actually be learning for the sake of learning? And it's I think this was a pivotal moment in her life because up to that point, all everything that had been driving her had been grades related in that sense, and so. Again, to emphasize how being in such a context might actually put undue emotional pressure on students like the one that we see here. Next, Hamid. And it was interesting that the student talks about being in a situation where her participation was determined, and participation points were determined by how much she spoke in English in class. And she says, "I really hate speaking English in front of others, but I did manage to push myself to speak a couple of times, but it felt like a huge burden." And so this is again a call for us to think about the emotional consequences of being situated in EMI contexts. Next. Very quickly, I'll talk about another area of inquiry. We all know Gen AI is very much a well investigated topic. Samantha Curl talked about it too in her lecture, talking about how Gen AI has kind of also impacted EMI. Next, please. And Hamid mentioned the need to develop a critical gaze, right? And I think that's vitally important. But I'd like to give a heads up to you, a shout out to an upcoming symposium that will take place a few weeks from now. It's going to be in Hong Kong, EMI instruction in the era of Gen AI. I'm not involved in it, though I will be in Hong Kong coincidentally on that same day speaking at a different symposium. But yes, again, to underscore how the interface of Gen AI and EMI is really a much sought after a line of inquiry these days. Next, please. So very briefly, we've talked about critical multilingual language awareness. We've talked about critical EMI as well, awareness development. I think ultimately what we need to consider is also how do we develop critical digital literacy, right? Among our students, how do we develop critical digital literacy among teachers, especially since we might be inundated by a host of things, including algorithmic bias that we encounter in Gen AI. Next. So I direct you to this article that I wrote with my three students. This was part of a special issue of System. If you're interested in learning more about critical digital literacy, I invite you to look at this special issue that came out last year. Next, please, Hamid. The next slide tells you what the other papers in this special issue look like and the topics that they engage in. But the point that we make is that we need to center critical digital literacy within language teacher education so that we can help shape the development of digital justice. Next. And here is the QR code to the article if you're interested in looking at it. But I like to call your attention also to another recent article, next please, that I've worked on that was published in Pedagogies. And at the same time, while we're pursuing perhaps a critical EMI agenda, I think it's also important that we make teachers, learners, teacher educators aware about the ethical implications, of course, in using Gen AI both within their learning and teaching. So next, please, Hamid. And here is the QR code to that article. If you're interested in this, I'm more than happy to talk about it in the Q&A. And finally, I would like to thank in the final slide, Nari Kim, my research assistant who helped assemble this collection of slides. Thank you once again. And Ahmed, thanks for advancing the slides. Happy to take on questions and to engage in conversation with all of you.
Yeah, thank you. And I should also thank Nari for her help. And yeah, we'd be happy to take questions and to hear more from you about how this resonates with you in different contexts.